She was already dead when he found her, or so he thought, until the rope creaked, and something inside that frozen wreck of a body drew one ragged, impossible breath. 7 years is a long time to talk to no one but a garden. Dane Ferro knew the exact number because he counted it in harvests, not calendars. 364 cycles of the hydroponic bay's grow lights, dimming and brightening on a rhythm he'd built with his own hands out of scavenged solar cells and a dead woman's stubborn optimism. The bay was the only warm room on Kessit Station, a mining outpost bolted to a moon that didn't have a name so much as a designation. And it held the only thing on this frozen, forgotten rock that still felt like a promise. Rows of beans climbed wire he'd bent from old conduit. Wheatgrass grew pale and eager under the lamps. And at the center, in a planter welded from scrap hull plating, stood a single stunted apple sapling barely 4 feet tall, grown from a seed his wife Wren had smuggled off the last supply shuttle before the company quietly stopped sending them at all. She used to say that seed was the most defiant thing either of them would ever own. A piece of earth, she called it, that refused to believe it had been abandoned, the same way she refused to believe the company's silence meant anything permanent. Wren had been like that. She found meaning in small, stubborn things because the large things, contracts, rescue schedules, the slow, bureaucratic forgetting of a colony too far out to matter, had a way of letting people down. Wren was 3 years gone now. Buried under permafrost he'd had to blast open with a mining charge, because the ground here didn't accept the dead easily, and didn't much care for the living either. She died the way most things died out here, quietly, from a respiratory infection that a proper hospital 3 systems away could have cleared in an afternoon, and that Kessit Station's aging medbay simply hadn't had the tools to touch. He'd held her hand through the worst of it, in a room too cold no matter how high he ran the heaters, and he'd promised her, in the last clear hour she had, that he'd keep the garden going. Not the station, not the mineral claim, the garden. She'd smiled at that, weak and amused, and told him that was of course exactly the right thing to promise. Dane still talked to the sapling like it was her. He told it about the storms that peeled panels off the west array. He told it when the rations ran low and he was stretching protein cake thinner than the label recommended. He told it on the worst nights that he didn't know anymore whether he was surviving out here or simply failing, slowly and with great effort, to die. The one rule he had never broken in 7 years of breaking almost everything else about the man he used to be was this: the garden came first, before his own comfort, before sleep, before hope, most days, because hope on Kessit Station was a resource that ran out faster than water did. If the bay's reclaimer failed and he had to choose, in the space of a few frantic minutes between saving his own oxygen scrubber or saving the grow bed's water cycler, he'd save the cycler every time. A man could hold his breath through a scare. Seedlings couldn't wait for him to fix his mistakes. The garden was the last living thread tying him to a version of himself that had once, briefly, been someone's husband, someone's partner, in a stubborn little rebellion against a company that had already written both of them off. He'd sworn it out loud once to the sapling itself, half joking and half not. Whatever else this moon took from him, it would not take that. He was checking the reclaimer valves, hands stiff with cold even inside the bay's relative warmth, when the perimeter alarm screamed for the first time in 4 years. He didn't remember reaching the airlock. He remembered the cold hitting his lungs like a fist as the outer door cycled, and he remembered past the ridge, in the long blue shadow thrown by a down transport pylon that had crashed there before he'd even arrived on this rock, something that stopped him harder than the cold ever could. She was hanging by the wrists, turning slightly in a wind that had no business being that gentle about something so cruel. Alien, unmistakably so, skin the color of wet slate, a second smaller pair of arms folded uselessly against her ribs, a crown of thin bioluminescent filaments running along her skull, gone dark and limp now, like a candle someone had pinched out on purpose. Rope, actual rope, crude and unmistakably human-made, was lashed around wrists that had bled, frozen, and bled again in whatever cycle of struggle had played out here before the cold finally won. Whoever had strung her up between those 2 twisted struts hadn't meant for the weather to be merciful. They'd meant it as a message, and they'd left before anyone could read it. He didn't decide to climb the strut. His body simply did it. Boots slipping on frost-slick metal, hands finding holds he wouldn't remember finding later. She wasn't breathing when he cut her down. He carried her into the warmth of the garden bay, because it was the only warm room he had left in his life, and because some unspoken part of him, moving faster than thought, already understood that this decision would not come free. Nothing on this moon ever had, he was right, it never is. Her name, once she could speak it 3 days later through lips still cracked white at the corners, was Isolde-Kai. Though she told him in the flat, over-careful standard of someone who'd learned the language from a captor rather than a teacher, that names were the first thing her people lost when they were taken from home. And she had been taken, traded, sold, marched overland by a raiding crew that stripped mining claims and border settlements alike for anything alive enough to fetch a price on a black exchange 2 systems over. She'd run from them once, into weather no one was meant to survive alone. She'd been caught. The rope had been left as a message for the next one who tried the same thing. Dane understood messages left out in the cold better than he wanted to. He'd sent enough of his own, over 7 years, transmissions into a silence that never once answered back. She was dying anyway, even cut down, even warm. Frostbite had already taken 2 fingers on her lower left hand and was arguing, with real conviction, for a foot. Her people's biology ran hot by design, dependent on a chemical heat cycling process through those bioluminescent filaments along her skull. And hers had gone completely dark from exposure and days without food. His medkit, cracked open on the floor between them, held exactly 1 vial of the wide-spectrum regenerative compound the company had issued him on arrival 7 years ago for his own emergencies. Not hers, his, for the day his own body finally failed him out here, alone, with no one left to notice, no one left to carry him anywhere. If he used it on her, he wouldn't have it for himself. Not for the next fall on black ice. Not for the next accident with the mining laser he still serviced alone, with no second pair of hands to call if something went wrong. Not for the day his own fingers, someday, went numb and dark the way hers had. He looked at his own hands for a long time, under the grow lights, turning them over, counting the small scars a decade of hard labor had left on them. Then he broke the seal on the vial and used it on her. Watching the frost-scared tissue on her ruined fingers knit slowly back together over the following hour. Watching pale color bleed back into filaments that had gone as dead and gray as ash, he understood, with total clarity, the size of what he'd just spent. He would grow old on this rock now with no second chances held in reserve. If the next accident came for him, and something always eventually came, out here, there would be nothing left in his kit to argue with death on his own behalf. He had traded his only spare future for a stranger's present. He didn't tell her that. He only watched her breathe, slow and steadying, and found to his own quiet unease that he minded the cost less than he'd expected to. That frightened him more than the cost itself ever could have. She stayed because she couldn't yet walk, and then she stayed a while longer because the sky over Kessit Station, cold and empty as it was the only sky in 3 systems that wasn't actively hunting her. She was suspicious of him for the first 2 weeks, in ways he recognized immediately and painfully. She flinched from sudden movement. She slept, when she slept at all, with her back against the bay's inner wall and her eyes on the door. She watched his hands far more than she ever watched his face, tracking them across a room the way a person tracks a weapon they aren't sure is loaded. He remembered wearing a version of that same posture himself the first year after Wren died, when even simple kindnesses from company voices on the comm had felt like debts he'd be asked to repay later, with interest in a currency he didn't have. Slowly, in the particular quiet built between 2 people who'd each been abandoned by different worlds in different ways, something began, cautiously, to thaw. She told him, in careful fragments over the following weeks, about a home she wasn't entirely sure still existed, the way she remembered it, a canopy world 3 jumps forward. Glass cities grown rather than built, streets that curved with the shape of living trees instead of engineered right angles, a family she hadn't seen since she was young enough that her filaments hadn't finished coloring in. Her mother, she said, used to braid small lights into those filaments before they'd developed their own glow, a custom reserved for children not yet old enough to burn on their own. He told her about Wren, about the mining charge and the frozen ground that hadn't wanted to take her, about the apple sapling, and how he counted years and harvests instead of calendars because calendars had started to feel like lies told by a clock that no longer meant anything to anyone but him. She was the first thing in 3 years who had asked him a question and then actually waited, patient and quiet, for the whole answer. He should have known, somewhere underneath the relief of company after so long alone, that a raiding crew that leaves a message strung up between two struts doesn't consider that message closed until someone reports back that it worked. They came 6 weeks later, in a scout lander with a company logo scraped roughly off its hull and a bounty transponder still broadcasting Isolde-Kai's ID code on a slow, patient repeat. Dane watched them on the exterior feed from the comms room. 3 armored figures moving with the unhurried calm of people who'd done this exact job enough times to know that fear wasn't necessary when you outgunned everyone on the rock by a wide margin. They pinged the station's public channel with a single flat line of text. Return the property, or we come get it, and either way we're paid the same. He had one working long-range transmitter left on the station, old, cannibalized twice already for parts over the years, and it was also his only functioning link to the outside possibility of rescue. It was the one thread still connecting Kessit Station to the idea that someday, some year, a company ship might come back for him, and he would not simply die out here counting harvests until the number stopped meaning anything at all. He'd kept that transmitter alive through failing components and jury-rigged solder for 7 straight years. The way another man might keep a single candle burning through a storm he wasn't sure would ever end. It was hope, physically wired into a battered metal box bolted to his wall. Jamming the raiders' tracking signal, scrambling their lock on Isolde-Kai's transponder before they could get a fix through the ridge's storm interference, would burn out the transmitter's core capacitor completely past any hope of field repair. He had exactly 1 spare capacitor left in his entire salvage stores, the only part on the moon capable of producing that kind of output. He stood in front of the console for a long, silent minute, his hand hovering over the toggle. He thought about the years already spent talking to a sapling because there'd been no one else left to talk to, and about what those years would become, doubled, tripled, indefinite, with the last flicker of possible rescue deliberately extinguished by his own hand. Then he thought about the way she'd flinched from him for 2 full weeks, the particular careful economy of someone who'd learned, through hard experience, that every hand reaching toward her was really reaching to take something away. He flipped the toggle. The capacitor screamed once, arced blue-white and violent across the transmitter housing, and died completely, filling the small room with the smell of burnt insulation. Static swallowed the raiders' tracking lock whole. Their scout lander circled the ridge twice, engines audibly confused, broadcasting the same thread over and over to a signal that no longer technically existed to threaten. And then, finally, grudgingly, it lifted off and burned hard for orbit, unwilling to waste more fuel hunting a needle that had simply stopped pinging in the static. They were gone. His rescue was gone with them, and this time there was no Vial left in reserve to fix what he'd just spent. If something failed on this station now, the reactor, the reclaimer, his own aging body giving out alone on some ordinary Tuesday, there would be no message going out to anyone ever again, asking for help. He'd built his entire quiet, careful peace with isolation around the buried idea that it was temporary, that somewhere, on some ledger, a clock was still counting down toward an ending where a ship eventually, someday, came. He'd just switched that clock off himself with his own hand for a girl he had known exactly 6 weeks. If you were standing where he was standing, hands still trembling on a dead toggle switch, the smell of burnt wire thick in the air around you, would you have made a different choice? Or is that only a question people get to ask from somewhere warm and safe, long after the moment that actually mattered has already closed? He didn't answer it, not even to himself. He just sat down slowly on the cold floor of the comms room and let the silence after the storm settle over him for what it actually was. The sound of a door closing, one he had chosen, with his own hand, to close. Isolde-Kai found him there almost an hour later. She didn't ask what he'd given up. She'd already seen the transmitter housing on her way in, blackened and dead and still faintly smoking at the edges. She sat down on the floor beside him instead, her 4 hands folded quietly in her lap, and said nothing at all, which he understood by then was the only real kind of comfort either of them had ever actually learned how to offer another person. For a while after that, something almost like a life took shape between them. She learned to work the hydroponic bay alongside him, her extra pair of hands making surprisingly short work of tasks that had always taken him twice as long alone. Threading bean vines, checking pH levels, coaxing the reclaimer back to life on the mornings it stuttered. She was fascinated in a quiet and genuine way by the apple sapling. Her people's world didn't have seasons like that, she explained. Things there grew and gave continuously, or didn't grow at all. The idea of a plant that bore fruit only once a cycle, and then waited, patient and entirely unbothered, for that cycle to come back around struck her as a small kind of miracle. She started sleeping through the night, without watching the door. He started, for the first time in 3 years, sleeping through the night without dreaming about permafrost and mining charges and ground that didn't want to give. He told himself the raiders wouldn't come back for a debt this small. He told himself a great many things in those weeks that he badly wanted to be true. There were small rituals now, the kind that only exist between two people who've decided, without ever quite saying so out loud, to keep each other. She taught him to say her real name properly, the way it was meant to sound before a captor flattened it into something easier for a human tongue, a soft double syllable with a click at the end that he never quite mastered, and that she never once mocked him for failing to get right. He taught her to graft a cutting from the apple sapling onto a second, a smaller rootstock he'd been keeping in reserve for years without any clear reason, so that if one tree ever failed, the other might carry the line forward. It felt, doing that work together under the grow lights, less like gardening and more like something closer to a vow neither of them was ready to name out loud. He caught himself, more than once, doing the quiet arithmetic of a future that included her in it, teaching her to run the reclaimer alone, showing her where the spare parts were cached, explaining which storms were survivable and which ones meant sealing every hatch on the station and waiting them out together in the dark. He told himself it was only practical. He didn't examine too closely why practical had started to feel. Some nights, like something considerably warmer than that. The truth arrived 11 weeks later, in the shape of a full retrieval cruiser. Not a scout lander circling twice and losing interest, but a proper armed vessel with a professional boarding crew and a contract that now named Isolde-Kai specifically, at a bounty that had apparently tripled once whoever was buying realized at exactly how rare her bloodline's filament coloring actually was on the open market. This was not a crew that would circle and leave when a signal went quiet. This was a crew that landed and searched room by room with methodical patience and had no intention of lifting off again without what they'd come for. Dane had exactly one option left with any real chance of working, and it was the one thing he had promised himself years ago, standing over Wren's grave with a mining charge still smoking in his hand that he would never, under any circumstance, use. Kessit Station's old emergency beacon, buried deep in the original colony charter, wired to a fail-safe distress protocol left over from the company's earliest, most desperate contracts, could trigger a planet-wide ident flare, visible to every ship in the system, human and otherwise, broadcasting the station's exact coordinates along with a live biometric feed of everyone still aboard. It was built for catastrophe. It was built on the old, blunt logic that a crowd of witnesses converging on a distress signal was safer than a quiet, unwitnessed death. But the flare would also broadcast his own biometric signature, his face, his name, his status as still, technically, inconveniently alive, straight into a company database that had quietly listed him as a presumed dead write-off years ago. Precisely so it could stop paying a colonist pension into an account no one thought would ever be claimed again. The instant that flare went out, Dane Ferro would exist again officially on paper, in ledgers, and every debt, every reclamation clause, every buried legal obligation the company had let quietly lapse when they assumed he'd died out here would come roaring back to life right alongside him. He might spend what remained of his years fighting a corporation with more lawyers than he had days left to live. He might be stripped of even the meager rights of a colonist and reclassified under some ancient salvage statute as company property himself, the exact fate he had sworn. Standing over Wren's grave, he would rather freeze to death alone on this rock than accept. He had promised himself, on the coldest, most furious day of his life, that he would die anonymous here before he let the company own him again. He'd meant it the way a man means a thing he never expects to actually be tested on, a private, comfortable certainty he'd carried around for years like a stone in his pocket. Worn smooth from handling, never once weighed against a real cost until this exact moment. Isolde-Kai was pressed into the narrow gap behind the reclaimer housing, 4 hands flat against the cold metal, filaments dimmed on purpose to nothing, trying to make herself smaller than a person can actually get. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the door, the same way she'd looked at every door for the first 2 weeks he'd known her. And something about seeing that old fear resurface, fully formed, after months of watching it fade, made the decision in front of him feel suddenly much simpler than all its legal consequences deserved to. The retrieval crew was 3 rooms away, methodically clearing the station corridor by corridor. He hit the beacon. The flare went out silent and total, a pulse no human eye could see, but every registered hull in the system would feel like a shout across the dark. Somewhere in a corporate database he had spent 7 careful years trying to stay erased from, a dead man's file flickered abruptly back to active status. The retrieval crew's own ship registered the identity flare and, bound by its own liability clauses against operating inside a now legally witnessed, now legally hot zone, aborted the boarding within minutes, pulling its crew back, cutting losses, lifting off rather than risk a salvage rights dispute with whatever authority was now, undoubtedly, inbound to answer a flare of that size. They left. Isolde-Kai was safe. Dane Ferro was once again on record as alive, and everything that meant every clause and claim and accumulated year of legal reclamation he'd hidden from simply by not existing on paper was already, he understood with a heavy certainty, beginning to move toward him across the dark between systems. Slow, patient, utterly certain of itself, the way debts always eventually are. The cruiser that answered the flare when it finally arrived 4 months later was not a rescue ship. It was a company adjudication vessel. And the man who stepped off it carried a tablet full of standing paperwork, instead of anything resembling a welcome. Dane spent the better part of the following year in proceedings he barely understood, fighting reclamation clauses written before he was even born, watching most of what little he'd built at Kessit Station, his salvage rights, his mineral claim, even partial legal rights to the station structure itself, get folded quietly back into company assets, all under contracts he'd signed as a much younger, much more hopeful man who'd still believed the company's promises meant something. He kept the garden bay. He fought harder for that single room than for anything else in the entire proceeding, and he won it, mostly because no lawyer on the company's payroll cared enough about a stunted apple sapling to argue past the first hearing. He never fully got his old anonymity back. He never fully got free of the debts that flare had reawakened. There were months where the company sent adjuster after adjuster to reinventory the station down to the last bolt, each one carrying a slightly different tablet, with a slightly different figure for exactly how much a man's 7 years of assumed death silence had cost them in unpaid liabilities. There were nights he sat alone in the comms room, staring at the blackened housing where the transmitter used to live, doing the same bleak arithmetic over and over. What he'd have owed if he'd simply let the raiders take her and stayed erased, against what he now owed for choosing not to. The numbers never came out kinder on either side of that equation, and he stopped running them eventually because some debts, he decided, were never meant to be settled by comparison. They were just the price, paid once, that didn't come with a receipt showing what the alternative would have cost. Working alone again in a bay that echoed differently now that she was gone, he still found himself wondering, some nights, whether he'd have made the same 3 calls, in the same order, if he'd known from the start exactly how heavy that final door would swing shut behind him. He never landed on an answer he fully trusted. He only ever landed on the fact that he'd made them anyway, one after another, each one heavier than the last, and that the sapling was still alive, and so was she, and so, against every reasonable expectation this moon had ever given him, was he. But Isolde-Kai got out. She left Kessit Station 3 months after the flare, on a court-mandated repatriation order that the company, ironically, could not quietly bury the way it had once buried Dane's own file, because now there were witnesses, now there was a legal record. Now the very system he'd triggered to save her was the same system that made her disappearance impossible to hide a second time. She boarded a transport on a cold morning with her filaments finally burning bright and steady gold, a color, she told him, in the last minutes before the airlock cycled, belonged to someone who was, at long last, going home. Before she boarded, she asked him, in that same careful, deliberate standard she'd never fully lost, whether he regretted it, all of it, the vial, the transmitter, the flare, whether, given the chance to choose again with full knowledge of the cost, A man who had once sworn to disappear completely from every ledger that ever tried to claim him would still choose 3 separate times to be found instead for her. He told her the truth, which was that regret was a luxury built for people who got to choose their cost after the fact safely, with the whole outcome already known, and he had never once gotten that privilege. He'd only ever gotten to choose it in the moment, standing in the cold, with someone else's life balanced on the other side of the decision. He said he didn't know if that made him wise, or simply incapable of doing anything else when it mattered. He said he'd plant another sapling this year, and maybe, if that one lived long enough to finally bear fruit, he'd let himself believe the choices had been worth exactly what they cost him. She left. The lander's engines lit the ridge gold for a moment, then blue white, then nothing at all, and Kessit Station went quiet again in the particular way it always did after any loss, except this time the quiet held a shape it hadn't held before, an absence with a name attached to it, instead of just another number added to a count of empty years. Dane Ferro is still out there as far as anyone knows, still tending a garden bay that keeps a promise he made to a dead woman years ago, still counting seasons instead of calendars, still talking to a sapling on the nights the silence gets too heavy to carry alone. He is, on paper now, a man with debts he'll likely spend the rest of his life slowly repaying, stripped of the quiet erasure he once believed was the only real safety this galaxy owed him. But somewhere 3 jumps forward under a canopy sky he will never personally see, a young woman with gold filaments is alive to grow old under a sun he will also never see. And some costs, turns out, were never actually about getting something back in return. They were only ever about what you were willing to become, the moment keeping what you had stopped being the point. Some sacrifices don't resolve, they don't balance out, and they don't hand you back a clean ledger at the end. They just sit in you afterward, permanently, the way frost sits in ground that never fully thaws even in the warmest season, ground you can still feel underfoot on a summer's day. And the real measure of a life, maybe, was never whether you managed to keep what you swore, in a weaker moment you'd keep forever. It's what you were willing to become instead, the day keeping it finally stopped being the point that mattered most. If this story found something in you worth sitting with a little longer, consider subscribing to Xeno Fantasy. There are more stories like this one waiting. Quiet, costly, and true in the particular way only fiction dares to be. We'll see you in the next one.